Hello, welcome to this Quickie Livecast. I'm Mags Galden with Grandma's Genes, and this is a Quickie Livecast discussing how to do a chart for endogamous communities who are involved in some sort of adoption, or you're working with an adoptee and you have so many families going on, you don't know how to get it all right in your brain. I'm a visual learner and I like seeing things on paper or in some sort of graph or a chart. It's easy to see things that way. And I had an experience with an adoptee where there was an incredibly endogamous community, and I had to figure out all of these families, and I ended up putting it on a chart. I've got a presentation that I did originally for the Ottawa Public Library System back in, I believe, February or March. And in that presentation, it was about an hour and a half, 2-hour presentation, I discussed how I did the chart for this. So we're going to bring that up. We're going to show you that. I'm also joined, I'll tell you how this happened. I'm a part of the DNA Detectives Facebook group. And this is a Facebook group where people answer questions. They ask questions about adoptions and DNA and how they can further their search using this DNA and information. So somebody asked a question yesterday, how somebody could create something that would make an endogamous family lineage clear. And I answered and saying, yeah, I have this chart that I do. I'll show you part of the chart. And as a part of that, another person popped up and said, I'm interested in this as well. And I said, well, why don't I do a Quickie Livecast and see if we can show people how to do a chart to help with their adoption and endogamous communities. So I'm joined by Ashley Gonzalez, who is a genealogy hobbyist, which doesn't really mean very much unless you say that she's a genealogy hobbyist who also helps adoptees or works with adoptees. And she has an interesting view on this because she does a lot of work with Cuban adoptee information. So Ashley, you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Hi, I'm Ashley Gonzalez. I've been working on my personal family genealogy for over 20 years. My dad was adopted. Using my DNA, I was able to find both of his biological parents. And for the past 15 years, I've been working on my husband's Cuban genealogy. And it is very difficult. The records are lacking. And so my in-laws both turned to DNA. And so here we are. Cuba is very endogamous in certain parts of their country, and I need to figure out how to sort everything.
And you mentioned earlier before the broadcast to me that a little bit of the struggles of working with Cuban records and things. Do you want to go into that just a hair before we get started?
A lot of the Cuban records are disintegrating. The churches are not maintaining them because they just don't have access to it. There are storms, bugs, things that are just deteriorating the records happening right now, and there's no preservation currently going on. And definitely some of the smaller communities, the larger communities, have a better preservation system. So getting the records from Cuba is extremely difficult. There are a couple of researchers who live within the country who have access to the churches. But for the most part, you're kind of working with nothing and some older historical books and historical family sketches.
Cool. That's fascinating. And having church documents in such a moist environment as a tropical island, I mean, that would just compound the whole issue of those documents deteriorating.
Yes.
That's an interesting story, and interesting that you're working on such a specific demographic. That is so cool, so cool. Right now, I'm going to pull up this presentation on, and a part of the presentation was on one of my adoptee help that I did for Betty Jean, and so we're going to start with that. Let's see if the screen share works okay for us. And it does. So I'm going to present this to everyone. Ashley, please feel free to chime in. And if we have people show up during the broadcast, we will add their comments or suggestions or questions too. As always, we have a live cast. It goes broadcast to everybody who follows the Grandma's Genes channel. And if you want to come in and sit in on one, let me know. So Betty Jean's DNA tests. She had 23andMe and Ancestry DNA tests done. And we took that information, we downloaded her raw data from both of those companies and uploaded it to GEDmatch. So we had a GEDmatch ability to do a lot of manipulation and analysis of her DNA. And so we just mentioned that. And we also put her information on WikiTree. WikiTree is the platform that I use for all of my clients and information for my own family, as well as the volunteer work that I do on WikiTree. So, all right, there we go. And here is Betty Jean's profile on WikiTree. You notice that her last name is formerly Galden, which means that she is related to me, in that she was adopted into my father's family. One of his uncles adopted Betty Jean, which is originally why I contacted Betty Jean and how I got involved in helping her figure out her adoption. So we'll move on to, yeah, we put in information about Betty Jean's story. I covered this earlier in the presentation. But you can really put your story out there and have it be available for people. And the DNA note, of course, went on the profile stating that she isn't related to any of the Galdens that are listed on her section. And that's important to note when you're doing a mirror tree for an adoptee. If you're creating a mirror tree for an adoptee, make sure that you delineate between the two family lines. One is a biological, and the DNA would be effective. We also have the information on the right-hand side of other DNA testers who might match her. And because there are no other DNA testers with the surname Galden or anyone connected to the Galden line, they don't show up. So we'll move on. My clicker's not working as it should. So DNA, her tests, her genes went into the three pools: 23andMe, Ancestry, DNA, and raw data was uploaded to GEDmatch. And Betty Jean had a very close DNA match on 23andMe, a cousin that we'll call Pat. And so here is Pat's DNA information. You see it's a really good 342.8 centimorgan match, which got me excited because I was like, oh, this is first cousin territory. We look at Blaine Bettinger's Shared Centimorgan Project information. This chart is available on the ISOG website. It's also available from Blaine's blog, thegeneticgenealogist.com. Thank you, Blaine, very much for letting me share this and use this in my presentation. If you notice, I've got first cousin once removed highlighted either from the great-grandparents line or the grandparents line. You notice that the amount of shared centimorgans that she had with Betty Jean, Pat would fall within those ranges for the DNA. So Betty Jean's DNA test at 23andMe showed that she had family members with the last names of Howard and Brotherton, a lot of them. And her new cousin that we just found, Pat, when we contacted her, we found out that she was working with another newfound cousin named Jane. She's also in Betty Jean's DNA matches. And Jane shared her family tree with us. Now, when I do this presentation to a live crowd, you know, when there are little bodies sitting in a room with me, I actually unfold this entire family tree, and it's a printout from an Ancestry family tree, and it is 20 pages long. And it literally will go from one end of the room to the back end of the room. So trying to wrap your hand around even a family tree pedigree chart like this is cumbersome. cumbersome. And I started using this to try and figure out what was going on. And I found that I could identify the most common surnames that were in this family tree: Arrowwood, Asbury, Brotherton, Barclay, Knight, Cashin, Childress, Cochran, Copeland, Howard, Little, McCoy, and Pritchard, among others. And I went from this printout of 20 pages of pedigree and looked to see what names were also in Betty Jean's DNA matches list. And they were Asbury, Brotherton, Barclay, Knight, Cashin, Cochran, Copeland, Howard, Little, McCoy, and Pritchard. You get the idea that there's lots of matches. So what do you do next? Well, I was having trouble figuring out all the connections linearly with that printout from Ancestry. So I thought I should make a chart. And I'll stop screen sharing real quick and show you the actual chart. And here's the chart, the very parts of the chart. You see the lines and the colors and the interconnectedness of some of the family lines. And here is the center of the chart. And I'm going to talk about this briefly or longly or whatever. But there's the very center of the chart. And the chart is, this chart here is made up of 8.5 by 11 sheets. And I started with that center piece of paper, and it grew to 8.5 by 11 sheets. And I glued them together so that there wasn't tape across the pages, because I wanted to be able to write on it. It's not easy to write on tape unless it's masking tape. And then if it's masking tape, it might cover up something you already had written. So I glued it like using school glue that kids use. Back to sharing this. So what do you do next? Make a chart. How are these surnames corrected? So I wrote down all the circle of all the DNA matches, and from there I started working out the family groups. And then I realized that I had two obvious groups, and the two obvious groups are obviously Betty Jean's paternal side, her father, and her maternal side, her mother. So I realized that I needed to focus on only one group. I had Betty Jean matching two strong DNA matches that I had contacted who were obviously a part of one group. So I removed the other group. And so here's kind of what the chart would look like. And yeah, it looks like a huge organized mess. Ashley, you think you can duplicate this?
No.
So it's a huge but organized mess. And this is a symbolism of the chart that I just showed you, the real life chart. So I wanted to remove two of the obvious groups. So I started taking off the names that weren't connected, that didn't have any matches with Pat and Jane and Betty, or they have matches with Betty Jean, but they didn't match Pat and Jane. So I knew that they were not a part of the group that would match those two DNA matches. Then I started removing names that were way distant matches, the matches that are, 30 centimorgans or lower, basically. And also, when I did that center piece in that chart that I showed you, excuse me, I did about 15 or 20 of her closest matches, and then I worked out from there. So here's what I came up with. We're a group of people connected to the Cashin family, to the Asbury family, to the Brotherton family, to the Howard family, and to the Little family. And you can see how kind of significant each one of these family lines are. And so what is left is where we start looking into the Tester's family and their matches and connections in depth. So, and it's just a part of the presentation with information on adoption information here in Ottawa. I'm just going to skip through that really quickly. Sorry, I have a bit of a bug. Excuse me. So in that chart, in the information in the DNA search, who is the common denominator? Who's the most common recent ancestor? And we've already been searching through the science of DNA, and we have isolated the major surnames. But who are the most likely characters? So I took the tree and I built the interconnected chart of the most likely surnames. Now we look for the most common ancestor within those groups. And so here we have the surnames, and we start looking through each one of these family groups. We see how they're interconnected. And we see that there's a common theme or a pattern emerging, that they all seem to connect back to this one Howard family. But who's the most common denominator in that information? Well, we found him, and we used the DNA matches and who they all had in common. They all went back to his grandchildren or his great-grandchildren, but they all connected back to Alan Howard. And if you go down on WikiTree, you can get a really cool list of all the descendants of this fella Howard, and it goes on and on and on for 8 pages. But the answer, the mother or the father of Betty Jean is in that list. So we worked through the list, Jane and I, who is actually a DNA adoption angel researcher in Florida. And we worked through the list and added people to Betty Jean's mirror tree. And once we narrowed down the family lines of the specific family names involved, we started looking for new people who could possibly do DNA tests. So knowing that Betty Jean was born in 1967 or 1927 in Asheville, we scoured directors for surnames that we knew were in that family group chart that we had created. And so we looked through the city directory, which you can see we're looking through here for Cashins. We also looked through the census record for those years, and we're looking through to see if there were any census records. Betty Jean, as a background on this, was an adoptee who was left. Her mother supposedly walked up to a nun and handed this baby to the nun and didn't tell her anything. The only thing that Betty Jean knew was that the nuns at this tuberculosis hospital told her that her mother had black hair and blue eyes. That's the only thing that we know from that information. When Betty Jean went to look in the Buncombe County records, the clerk in the 1950s, when she went, literally held open her adoption file and said, we couldn't tell you anything if we could, but I'll show you. There is absolutely no information in your file, no paperwork, nothing. So Betty Jean has information that her mother gave her, and that was it. So the old cliche, one of the things that we did when we had these names, is we started looking for familiar similarities to people that we found on Facebook. So these people, and in family trees that we found online. So this is a Facebook post picture. This is Betty Jean on the left, and on the right is a woman who is connected to one of these family lines. And we started looking at some of the comparisons. These are Betty Jean at different ages. Betty Jean is a youngster, Betty Jean middle-aged, and Betty Jean is the wonderful person that she is today. Then we found pictures on Facebook of people, and we started comparing Betty Jean's different age pictures to the relevant age of the people that we found in Facebook and family tree posts. This one right here is absolutely uncanny. Betty Jean and this person, to me, to my eyes, would be sisters. They look so alike. And then we found this picture, and we're like, and then we found this picture of somebody else that matches these these people, and we started looking through more of them on all of the social media that we could find, and we tried to connect those people to the chart that we had made up. And you could find people that we suspect are living cousins by scouring social media for clues. In the friends area of a Facebook post, friends equal family. You can also look at photos. Remember all those pictures of resemblances? Well, one of the pictures that we found was this picture. Somebody had a dog in a sidecar wearing goggles, but do you notice something specific about the goggles? There's a picture of somebody in the goggles. Believe it or not, this is one of Betty Jean's cousins. And there's a family resemblance in that picture that you can find. So, do we think that the people we find are very close? Well, we tell them about Betty Jean's story, and we ask them to do DNA tests. Once we find these people that we think, guessing at pictures, looking at city directories, looking through genealogies and Facebook and other social media, we start asking people if they'll do a DNA test. And fortunately for Betty Jean, we found people who would. So the very first thing we did, we found a new second half cousin of the people that we asked to test. And then we started looking. We looked to see how the connection was in the ranges, and we second cousin. Then we found a new half first cousin. You notice that the numbers are growing. They're going up to from 274 to the cousin that we had, the 342, and then they went up to, and the Pat Brotherton is the one that was the other adoptee. And then we found, amazingly, a new half brother. And you look at the range there of the DNA, 1769.1, and you go back, let's see, we go back to Blaine Benninger's wonderful chart, and we see a half sibling, and that gentleman fell right within the range. And we proved that Betty Jean had a half sibling, all from the chart we did. If we hadn't have done that chart, we wouldn't have been able to figure anything out because it was just too hard to put our minds around it. And remember, we were looking back through those pictures at resemblances. This is Betty Jean's father, whose name is Glenn Cashin. So we finished out by doing this tree. I want to go back, though, real quickly and show you some of the numbers. Like the number that we had for the cousin, Pat Brotherton, 342.8. That's a really high cousin match for the level of cousin that Pat is. And that number is blown up or made bigger because this is an endogamous demographic. And that goes to the question that was asked in DNA Detectives was, how do you work with DNA? How do you figure out in an endogamous community, how do you figure out where to go? Well, my first thing was to put together the chart, and I should unfold the chart and show you the whole thing, but to put together that chart and then draw lines around it. So I started with a circle of the 15 or 20 top DNA matches, and you can see them here in this list. And I put them on either side of the adoptee and drew a circle. And then from them, I started working out the different family lines, the McCoy line, the Pritchard line, the Howard line, as we showed you in that the graphic for the chart. And then taking that, finding the most common recent ancestor, and then working from that back through all the cousins, looking in social media, city directories, all of the information that we could to try and find information so that we could populate that chart and then have those lines start to connect. And I'm going to stop sharing to show you how this chart looks. It's an ugly thing, but it sure did work. It sure did help. So I don't know if it's focusing well. Ashley, can you see that well?
I can.
Oh, good. So you see it's a big mess of lines interconnecting and everything. And we ended up finding way down here, off to the side. Here we come, and here is Betty Jean's grandfather. So we found the grandfather, and we found his descendants, living descendants, and we got them to test, which gave us, in the end, this chart here that I put together, anonymizing the names of the testers and information. But you can see that coming up with these people, you can see how we worked our way towards it. The lower connections, we had all of these 20 or so people on that chart. And you can see how the DNA grows in size, the shared centimorgans. And as we worked through this list and these people, and we found more testers, the shared centimorgans go up to 147, to 274, to 994, and eventually to 1769.1, which was the new half-brother. And you can see again on the shared centimorgan chart, and then I showed you a beautiful picture of her father. We are currently still working to find her mother. The investigator in Florida has got some personal issues that she's dealing with family. And so we've been kind of on hold while we've been doing some other stuff. I've been traveling a lot speaking. But we have the maternal group identified. And I'm going to take the maternal information and create another DNA chart. So here is Betty Jean's WikiTree profile for her mirrored tree. We discovered her last name is Cashin. I don't know how much of this I have identified. We had more information into her biography on her mirrored tree. You can also see that she has new DNA information that shows up with her half-brother showing up as her DNA connection. And this isn't a live cast to promote WikiTree, but WikiTree and its DNA tools are so robust that having an endogamous community, WikiTree is really good in helping with that because it auto-populates all of the families with all of your DNA test information, and even those interconnected families, all that DNA information comes up. Here is Betty Jean's pedigree chart showing her line going back. And then you see it going back to one of Alan Howard's great-grandsons there, John Henderson Howard. And then I have some resource and links. I'll just throw this up for a minute. Some of it is Ottawa specific. This page isn't. But also Betty Jean's story. I have a blog that goes on about how she was done. All of this information is free to access. Read through Betty Jean's blog story. It's free to access. I believe in trying to help adoptees through my work. So I believe that's pretty much the end of it. Oh, and here's a bunch of social media stuff. You'll be able to link off to any of these you'd like to by clicking the link. And that's it. So I'll stop presenting and I'll come back and you'll see my lovely face. So Ashley, did you have questions while I was talking? I can certainly scroll back on the presentation and share a page if you have specific questions.
No, I was just trying to think of how I would apply this to my specific problems with my Cuban adoptees. Part of the problem is we have a lot of people testing with no tree, or the tree itself will have one or two individuals in it. And then to top that off, the commonness of the names.
Right.
So we have a lot of the same repeating names, not necessarily because of endogamy, but just because that's how the communities are. So I'm just trying to figure out how I could start creating a chart like that for one specific person where we're having difficulties even finding trees
right
to start with.
I imagine also being Cuban that I'm just sharing the chart again, the basic chart. I'm also thinking that being Cuban, I don't know how much of a social media presence there is for the demographic in Cuba. Can you make a comment about that? What is your
there are a few people in Cuba with social media. There are more, obviously, here in the United States with social media. So some of my Cuban adoptees were actually born here with Cuban roots, and then some were born in Cuba and adopted in Cuba. And the adoptions were not always legal like they are here, too. You know, you have people adopted here with no background whatsoever and no legality with it. So it goes both ways. I'm just trying to figure out how I could even start this. And then I'm thinking, well, maybe I could start it with whom matches whom and start a chart similar to that.
Yeah. And the other thing is taking lines that crisscross like that, having a chart where you have the family groups identified and segregated. I mean, you start to see patterns. The first pattern you're going to see is that there are two specific groups, and that's going to be the maternal group and the paternal group.
Yeah.
And if you can separate those out on your chart, I ended up taking the big chart and creating this chart that you see on the screen because I knew that it was a specific line. I didn't know if it was paternal or maternal at the time.
Yeah.
But I broke it up into the two groups so that I could focus only on one group at a time. And it ended up being the paternal line.
Well, a lot of the people, especially in reference to my father-in-law, I am figuring out they are probably related on both sides in some fashion. And so that's where it starts to get a little iffy. Which one is more closely related? Are they more closely related on the maternal, or are they more closely related on the paternal?
With an endogamous community that is that has boundaries that have been solidified and kept pretty strict by just the geographic area, and by also by the type of country that Cuba is, and the fact that some countries were boycotting visiting. Your endogamous situation could be compounded even more because of that.
Yep. The other thing that I run into also, when you go a little further back in time, early 1800s and later, based on social class, sometimes they would choose the maternal last name over the paternal one.
That's interesting. That happens often in indigenous communities as well.
Yes.
Like the Native American communities are matrilineal rather than patrilineal. Some Jewish communities, they are matrilineal. The families go by the mother rather than the father. It's interesting.
Yep.
And to know some of those little nuggets of information when you're working with this particularly endogamous community, it's important to know that information. So let me ask you this. When you get your chart put together, you're going to take a picture of it and post it in the DNA Detectives group so we can see what it looks like?
I might. I actually have one adoptee I think I'm going to try this with. His name is Ton, and Ton was born in Vietnam. And half of his DNA is Vietnamese Asian, and the other half of his DNA is quite Cuban with the mixture.
Wow.
And yeah, and when Ancestry released their genealogical areas, I forgot what they call that now.
Right.
When they released that, he fell squarely into the Cuban Venezuelan community. And so I have a couple of mirror trees created for him with a couple of different families. He's actually related to another relative of my husband's. And so I think I may start with his first because I can obviously divide it up easier and go from there and see what I can come up with for him.
Well, make sure you try and use, I know that the parish records are deteriorating, And I don't know for Cuba if they have census. I'm sure they have census records. I don't know if you can get to those. I mean, what is the situation with that? Census records in Cuba. Sounds like Ashley may have dropped out. Oh, there she is.
I'm working out of 1735 census. So there were census records, but I have not been able to get my hands on anything after 1850. So it becomes a little more difficult, but there are a couple of people out there who have some very well-built trees.
Right.
That he might possibly tie into in one of the larger families with the last name Verona. So that's where I'm going to attack it, is from the Verona family.
Verona with a V or with a B like Bubba?
With a V like Victor.
Oh, okay, cool. What about city directories in that area?
You can find them sometimes on Google Books.
Okay.
You can find references to people in Google Books. Some communities, people have started blogs on the history of the communities, which also includes people, like random people. So I always do a full search on Google to see if I can find anything that's been written about them first.
Well, Ashley, I really appreciate you coming on, and we do have some viewers watching, which is exciting. I appreciate you being here, and this was so impromptu and so LiveCast Quickie. That's what you're all about. I appreciate you being here, and thank you so much. I'm gonna say bye, Ashley.
Bye.
And I'm gonna stop the broadcast. Thank you very much. This has been a LiveCast Quickie with Grandma's Jeans and Mags Galden.